Ever heard of winning a war by not fighting? It sounds crazy, right? But what if I told you that one of the greatest military minds in history, Hannibal Barca, the guy who marched elephants over the Alps, was brought to a standstill by a Roman general who simply refused to give him the battle he craved? This is the incredible story of Quintus Fabius Maximus, the man they called Kung. His strategy was so controversial it nearly got him fired, yet it ultimately saved Rome from annihilation. Stick around because we're about to dive into how an old-school Roman aristocrat used patience as his ultimate weapon against a genius of warfare. Our story begins in 218 BC. The Second Punic War has just erupted between Rome and its arch-rival Carthage, and leading the Carthaginian charge is Hannibal Barca, a name that would soon send shivers down every Roman spine. He wasn't just a general. He was a strategic prodigy. He accomplishes the impossible, leading his army, complete with war, elephants, on a treacherous journey across the Alps and into Italy. Rome, confident in its military might, sends its legions to meet him. What happens next is a series of catastrophic defeats for the Romans. First at the Trebia River, then at Lake Trasimene. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers are killed, and panic grips the city. It seemed like nothing could stop Hannibal's relentless advance. In this moment of absolute crisis, when Rome's very existence hung by a thread, the Senate took a drastic step. They appointed a dictator, a temporary leader with absolute power, to save the Republic. Their choice was a man in his late 50s, a veteran politician and soldier named Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius was the polar opposite of the brash, aggressive generals who had just been annihilated by Hannibal. He was cautious, deliberate, and deeply traditional. He wasn't the kind of leader who inspired fiery speeches or daring charges. Instead, he possessed a quiet, unshakable resolve. He looked at the situation not as a chance for glory, but as a problem to be solved with cold, hard logic. And his logic was simple but profound. If fighting Hannibal head-on leads to disaster, then the answer is to not fight him head-on. Fabius understood Hannibal better than anyone else. He knew Hannibal was a genius on the battlefield, a master of ambush and encirclement. He also knew Hannibal's army was far from home, deep in enemy territory. They had no reliable supply lines, no way to get reinforcements easily, and they couldn't replace their losses. Hannibal's entire strategy depended on one thing: luring the Roman legions into a decisive, pitched battle where he could destroy them, break the Roman spirit, and convince Rome's allies to defect. Fabius's plan was to deny Hannibal that one thing. This revolutionary approach became known as the Fabian Strategy. It was a war of attrition, a game of cat and mouse played across the Italian countryside. Instead of marching his army out to meet Hannibal, Fabius shadowed him. He kept his legions on the high ground, in defensible positions where Hannibal couldn't force a battle on his own terms. From these vantage points, Fabius watched. He tracked Hannibal's every move. He learned his patterns, his tendencies, and his needs. His forces would launch small-scale raids on Hannibal's foraging parties, the soldiers sent out to find food and supplies for the main army. They'd harass his scouts, cut off his messengers, and attack his stragglers. Every bag of grain captured, every supply wagon burned, was a small victory. These weren't glorious battles that would be carved onto monuments, but they were slowly and surely bleeding Hannibal's army dry. Fabius was fighting 1,000 tiny cuts instead of one big sword fight. He was turning Hannibal's greatest strength, his tactical brilliance, into a useless asset. What good is a master swordsman if his opponent refuses to draw his sword? But while this strategy was brilliant, it was deeply unpopular back in Rome. The Roman people and the political elite were raised on a tradition of aggressive warfare and glorious victory. They saw Fabius's tactics as cowardly and un-Roman. Where were the triumphant battles? Where was the honor in hiding in the hills, while an enemy army roamed freely through their homeland? Hannibal, being a master of psychological warfare, cleverly fueled this descent. He would march his army through the Italian countryside, burning farms and villages, but he deliberately ordered his men to spare the estates belonging to Fabius. This made it look like Fabius had made a secret deal with the enemy. The public outcry was immense. Fabius, his own master of the horse, his second-in-command, Marcus Minucius, Rufus, was one of his loudest critics, openly calling for a more aggressive approach. The pressure on Fabius became unbearable. The people gave him the mocking nickname Conctiter, which means the delay. They saw him as a ditherer, a coward who was prolonging the war. The Senate, bowing to popular demand, took an unprecedented step. They promoted Minucius, the aggressive second-in-command, to have equal authority with Fabius. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Now Rome effectively had two dictators with two completely opposite strategies. Minucius, eager to prove his worth, immediately took his half of the army and sought a direct confrontation with Hannibal. And Hannibal, the master of traps, was more than happy to oblige. He laid a classic ambush, drawing Minucius's legions into a valley and then surrounding them. It was Lake Trasimene all over again. Minucius and his men were on the brink of complete annihilation. But then, something incredible happened. Fabius, who had been watching from the hills with his own troops, saw the disaster unfolding. He could have let Minucius be destroyed. It would have proven him right, once and for all. It would have been his "I told you so" moment, written in blood. But Fabius was a Roman first and foremost. He put the safety of the Republic above his own pride and reputation. He gave the order to advance, and his fresh legions descended from the hills, attacking Hannibal's forces from the rear and providing an escape route for Minucius's battered soldiers. He saved the very man who had undermined him. That day, a humbled Minucius reportedly turned to his men and said, "We have learned that we cannot defeat Hannibal, but we have also learned that we have been defeated by Fabius." He willingly placed himself back under Fabius's sole command. This act of rescue finally proved to the Romans the wisdom of the Fabian strategy. Fabius had saved the army, but his term as dictator was ending. And unfortunately, the Romans had short memories. The following year, 216 BC, new consuls were elected who promised to abandon Fabius's cowardly tactics and crush Hannibal once and for all. Their names were Varro. They gathered the largest army Rome had ever assembled, some 80,000 men, and marched to a place called Cannae. They were going to give Hannibal the decisive battle he had been waiting for, and it was a catastrophe beyond imagination. At the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal executed a perfect double envelopment, surrounding and annihilating the massive Roman force. It is still considered one of the greatest tactical masterpieces in military history, and one of Rome's darkest days. Tens of thousands of Romans were killed. The defeat was so total that Hannibal's cavalry commander supposedly urged him to march on Rome itself. In the aftermath of Cannae, with Rome on its knees and its allies beginning to defect, who did they turn to? They turned back to the man they had mocked, the man whose advice they had ignored. They turned back to Fabius Maximus, the delayer. He was elected consul again, and his strategy was once again adopted as Rome's official policy. For the next several years, Rome returned to the War of Attrition. No more grand battles in Italy. They harassed Hannibal, contained him in southern Italy, and focused on reconquering the cities that had defected. They slowly rebuilt their strength and their confidence. Fabius never defeated Hannibal in a major field battle. He denied Hannibal the victory he needed to win the war. He wore him down, exhausted his resources, and kept Rome in the fight long enough for another, younger general to emerge. Scipio Africanus. It was Scipio who would eventually take the fight to Carthage's doorstep in Africa, forcing Hannibal to leave Italy to defend his homeland, and ultimately defeating him at the Battle of Zama. But Scipio's victory would have been impossible without Fabius. Fabius was the shield that protected Rome when it was most vulnerable, allowing the sword Scipio to be forged. He taught Rome a vital lesson, that sometimes the wisest courage is the courage to wait, to endure, and to refuse to play your enemy's game. His strategy became a blueprint for centuries to come, a testament to the idea that victory doesn't always come from a climactic battle, but from relentless patience and strategic exhaustion. So the next time you hear about a great military victory, remember the story of Quintus Fabius Maximus, the general who saved his country by choosing not to fight. He may have been called the delayer, but in the end, he ensured that the Roman Republic would have a future to delay for. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into history, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories you might not have learned in school. See you next time.